On September 19th, 1356, a battlefield in the Loire Valley of France would witness a clash that would redefine medieval warfare forever. 3 points: the tactical genius of the ground. The ridge at Maupertuis was more than just a geographical feature. It was the perfect stage for the English longbowmen to unleash their devastating power against the French cavalry. The decisive use of longbows. The English archers, positioned strategically on both sides of the narrow lane, decimated the French cavalry with a barrage of arrows that turned the charge into a catastrophic disaster for the French. A bold counterattack. When the French 3rd Division inexplicably retreated, the Black Prince seized the moment. Leading a counterattack against the exposed and disoriented French 4th Division, he turned defense into a decisive victory. Reflect on how understanding the terrain and leveraging your strengths can turn the tide in any challenge you face. Just as the Black Prince did at Poitiers, sometimes the best offense is a well-executed counterattack. Take inspiration from this historic battle and apply these lessons to your own life and endeavors. September 19th, 1356. A ridge south of the city of Poitiers in the Loire Valley of France. The morning begins with fog. It lies thick over the vineyards and the hedgerows, and the narrow lane that winds between the French army and the English position on the ridge, softening the distances, muffling the particular sounds of 8,000 armored men finishing their preparations in the gray light before dawn. The French horses stamp and breathe. The banner of King John II of France, the fleur-de-lis on a field of deepest blue, rises above the formation as the fog begins to thin, catching a color that the morning light has not yet fully provided, as if the banner is manufacturing its own authority from thin air. But the fog is thinning, and what it reveals to anyone watching from the ridge is not a view that inspires confidence. Below the ridge, the French army is magnificent. 8,000 knights and men-at-arms in the finest armor that 14th century France could produce, backed by thousands of infantry and crossbowmen, the accumulated military power of the greatest kingdom in Europe, assembled to destroy a single English force that has spent 3 months raiding and burning its way across the French countryside with what King John II regards as intolerable arrogance. The nobility of France is here, in person, because this is the kind of battle that French chivalric tradition demands personal participation. The dukes and counts and viscounts who owe the king their military service have brought their households, their retinues, their destriers, and their lances, and the specific pride of men who believe they are the best fighting men in the world. On the ridge above them, 6,000 Anglo-Gascon soldiers wait. 6,000. Against 8,000 of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, plus their supporting forces. The English have been marching and raiding for 3 months. They are hungry. Their food ran out yesterday, and this morning's Mass was celebrated on empty stomachs by men who have not slept well in a week. Their supply wagons are behind them, arranged in a defensive laager that tells every man in the formation exactly how much room there is to retreat. The Miosol River is behind the wagons. There is nowhere to go. The Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, Prince of Wales, 26 years old, son of the king who broke France at Crécy a decade earlier, sits on his horse on the ridge and watches the French army assemble below and makes a decision. He will not run. What happens in the next 8 hours will end with a king of France captured on a battlefield for the first time in 3 centuries, with French chivalry destroyed as an effective military concept for a generation, and with the entire system of feudal warfare permanently exposed as something that English archers with Welsh yew bows had already figured out how to kill in large quantities at range. This battle changed medieval warfare forever. It was the day Poitiers finished what Crécy began. And it started with fog and hunger and a prince who had nowhere left to retreat. The war between England and France in 1356 was, by the standards of medieval dynastic conflict, a remarkably clean grievance. Edward III of England claimed the French throne. He was not delusional about this. His mother was Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, and when the Capetian male line died out in 1328, Edward's claim through the female line was at least as technically valid as the claim of Philip VI of Valois, who took the throne instead on the argument that French inheritance could not pass through women. The French disagreed. The English pressed the point with armies. 10 years before Poitiers, Edward III had demonstrated the point with devastating clarity at Crécy, a battle in August 1346 on a ridge in northern France where English longbowmen had shot the French cavalry to pieces in the space of an afternoon, killing the Duke of Lorraine, the King of Bohemia, and 1,500 knights, alongside thousands of lesser men-at-arms. Crécy was a catastrophe for French chivalry, and what made it worse was that it was a catastrophe inflicted by common archers, men of no particular social standing, yeomen and bowmen from Wales and the English countryside, who had used 3-foot arrows and 6-foot bows to kill the most expensive fighting men in Europe, faster than the most expensive fighting men in Europe could cross a field. The lesson of Crécy was plain. French military culture refused to learn it. The intervening decade had seen the Treaty of Calais, plague, dynastic negotiation, and the slow reassembly of French military confidence under John II, who had taken the throne in 1350. John was 44 years old in 1356, a man whose personal courage was not in question. He would demonstrate it before this day was over, and the demonstration would cost him everything. His political judgment was less reliable. He had spent 6 years managing a kingdom still suffering from the Black Death, a nobility that was fractious and proud, and a financial situation that the costs of the previous war had made genuinely desperate. What he needed in the autumn of 1356 was a victory. the Black Prince gave him the opportunity. Edward of Woodstock had been conducting a chevauchée through southwestern France since late July, a deliberate military strategy of raiding and devastation, burning villages and crops and towns, denying France the agricultural revenue of entire regions, while simultaneously enriching the English force with plunder. The chevauchée was not gentle. It was, by design, a demonstration that John II could not protect his kingdom, that English forces could move where they wished through French territory, that the most Christian king in Europe was unable to prevent the destruction of the lands and people he was sworn to defend. John assembled an army and marched south. The Black Prince turned back toward English-held Bordeaux with his plunder and his raiders, and John caught up with him south of Poitiers on September 17th, and the English found themselves in a position that their chevauchée doctrine was not designed to produce. They were trapped between a superior French force to the north and the river Meusson to the south. They needed time. The Cardinal of Périgord, a papal representative who had been following both armies, trying to prevent exactly this confrontation, spent September 17th and 18th riding back and forth between the two camps with proposals for a negotiated settlement. The Black Prince offered to return everything he had plundered, to swear not to fight against France for 7 years, to release any prisoners he held. These were not trivial concessions. They were, in fact, the substance of what a negotiated settlement might reasonably produce. John refused them. He wanted a battle. He needed a battle. His nobles were assembled and armored and spoiling for the fight that would recover French honor from Crécy. To accept the Black Prince's terms would be to admit that the assembled chivalry of France had marched south and allowed an English raiding force to negotiate its way home. That was not acceptable to a king who understood that his authority rested partly on the willingness of his nobles to respect him. He sent word that the prince might surrender himself and 100 of his knights, and John would release the rest of the English force on parole. The Black Prince declined. The Cardinal of Périgord made one final attempt on the morning of September 19th, riding between the armies as they assembled, carrying proposals that both sides knew would not be accepted, performing the ritual of diplomacy that the occasion demanded before the killing began. By mid-morning, he had exhausted his possibilities and ridden off the field. The sources for the Battle of Poitiers are multiple and not entirely consistent. Jean Froissart, the Flemish chronicler who compiled his account from interviews with participants on both sides over the decades following the battle, provides the most detailed narrative and the most vivid detail. But Froissart wrote for a chivalric audience, and his account tends to emphasize the personal honor of individual knights rather than the tactical mechanics of what actually happened. Geoffrey Le Bécaire, an English chronicler writing closer to the events, provides a more militarily analytical account. Together, and with the additional testimony of surviving letters and administrative documents, they allow a reconstruction that is reliable in its broad outlines, while uncertain in some of its specific sequences. What they agree on is what the French were bringing to the field. The first division of the French army, 4 divisions in total, each commanded by a great lord, was the Mounted Division under the marshals Jean de Clermont and Arnoul d'Audrem. These were the cavalry who would lead the assault, perhaps 300 lances of armored horsemen whose job was to break the English archer line with speed before the archers could destroy them as they had destroyed the cavalry at Crécy. Clermont and Audrem had argued over this question in the French War Council, whether the cavalry could succeed where Crécy had proven cavalry could not, and the argument had not been cleanly resolved in favor of either position. They would charge anyway, because charging was what cavalry did. Behind the Mounted Division came the Dauphin's division on foot, knights and men-at-arms who had removed their spurs and were prepared to advance as infantry, learning from Crécy's lesson that horses provided only a faster path to the archer's range. Their leader was the Dauphin Charles, 17 years old, his first battle, surrounded by experienced men who would keep him alive if they could. The 3rd Division, under the Duke of Orléans, was also on foot. The 4th Division, the largest, the most prestigious, was King John's own, advancing last, commanded personally by the king. John fought on foot. His personal standard was carried before him. He held an axe and wore no distinguishing mark that would make him a particular target. He had heard the argument that kings should not personally engage in battle, and had dismissed it. He intended to lead from the front. Against all of this, the 4 divisions, the assembled chivalry of France, the weight of numerical and social and military prestige, the Black Prince had 6,000 hungry soldiers and the ridge at Maupertuis. The ridge was enough. Barely. The ground that saved them. The ridge of Maupertuis was not a dramatic geographical feature. It was not a mountain pass or a river crossing or a fortified hilltop. It was a gentle rise in the French countryside, covered in vineyard and scrubland, cut by the narrow lane that ran north from the English position toward the approaching French army, and bounded on both sides by hedgerows dense enough to channel movement into predictable corridors. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of ground that made the English longbow most devastating and the French cavalry least effective. The lane was the critical feature. Approximately 15 feet wide between the hedgerows, it forced any force advancing from the north toward the English ridge to approach in a column rather than a line, the specific formation that compressed cavalry into a narrower front where numbers couldn't matter, where the men on the flanks couldn't swing outward because the hedgerows pressed them back, where every horse entering the lane entered a field of fire that English archers on both sides could saturate without exposing themselves to the cavalry's lance range. The Black Prince had positioned his archers on both sides of this lane in the 2 days he had been on the ridge, cutting gaps in the hedgerows at angles that gave the bowmen clear lines of fire into the lane, while the hedgerows themselves protected the archers from direct cavalry engagement. This was not accidental. The positioning was deliberate, the product of a commander who had grown up watching his father's army at Crécy and who understood, with the specific tactical intelligence of a young man who has been educated in the one subject that matters to him most, exactly what the longbow could do in the right geography. The English longbow, in the hands of a trained archer, was a weapon of remarkable technical capability. A war bow of the English type required a draw weight of between 100 and 150 pounds. The force required to draw the string to the ear, not the chest, which was the English technique, and which maximized both the arrow's velocity and the range to which it could be driven accurately. An experienced archer could lose 12 arrows per minute under controlled conditions, and the arrows themselves, the war arrows of 1356, iron-bodied broadheads on poplar shafts with goose feather fletching, could penetrate plate armor at ranges below 100 yards when fired at the proper angle. At longer ranges, they would not penetrate quality plate, but they would reliably penetrate the horses that carried the armored men, which was often sufficient. The arrows, the range, the hedgerows. The Black Prince positioned his archers and then positioned his men-at-arms in the center and rear of the English position, dismounted on foot, to hold the line when the archers' shooting was done and the French infantry closed to hand-to-hand distance. He placed the Captal de Bouc, Jean de Grailly, a Gascon lord of considerable tactical competence and personal ferocity, with a mobile reserve of mounted men-at-arms and a contingent of archers on the far right flank, screened by the ridge, invisible to the advancing French. This unit was the Black Prince's answer to a question he had not yet asked aloud. What happens if the French actually reach the line and the archers run out of arrows before the French run out of men? The answer was a cavalry charge from the flank into the rear of whatever French force had pushed past the archers. But only if the timing was right, and timing in medieval battles was a profoundly uncertain thing. On the morning of September 19th, while the Cardinal of Périgord was performing his final diplomatic rituals, Jean Chandos rode with the Black Prince along the English position. Chandos was the prince's most trusted military advisor, a knight of extraordinary tactical sophistication who had fought in campaigns across France and who regarded the current situation with the particular calm of someone who has assessed it completely and arrived at a conclusion. His conclusion was that the English could win this fight. The prince needed to hear it said by someone whose judgment he trusted completely. Chandos said it. The Black Prince gave the order to prepare. The night before had been spent in a discipline that was more a function of exhaustion than of conscious virtue. The English and Gascon soldiers, archers, men-at-arms, the wagon train crews, the mounted knights who would fight on foot, had been on the ridge for 2 days, alternating watch duties with the sleep that fear makes difficult and hunger makes worse. The food situation was serious. The foraging parties that went out on the 17th and 18th found little. The countryside had been burned and stripped by the Black Prince's own chevauchée on the way through, and what remained was guarded by French forces that made large foraging parties dangerous. The English army was fighting on empty stomachs. The chaplains said dawn mass in groups moving along the line, the Latin of the liturgy spoken at a pace that compressed the service without removing its sacramental weight. Soldiers receiving communion who understood that the theology of what they were doing required them to be in a state of grace, and who were not going to examine too carefully whether the state of grace required by the theology and the state they were actually in were entirely compatible. An archer from Shropshire, call him Thomas, because Thomas was a common name in 1356, and any name serves the same function here, strung his bow in the gray light before dawn, an operation he had performed 10,000 times in the 10 years since he had been old enough to be useful. The bow was 6 feet of yew heartwood and sapwood, the spine cut to follow the natural grain of the stave, its power stored in the difference between tension and compression that made the yew tree uniquely suited to this purpose. He ran his thumb along the string, checking the nock for wear, checking the serving where the arrows would be nocked, feeling for any fraying that might cause a misfire at the wrong moment. Around him, other archers were doing the same thing. They did not speak much. They had been through enough days like this that the ritual of preparation had absorbed the energy that speech would otherwise require. They ate what they had, which was not much, and they knocked their first arrows to their strings, and they looked north into the fog, and waited for it to lift. The fog lifted. The French came into view. 8,000 men. Thomas looked at them, and then looked away, and knocked his first arrow more firmly, and said, under his breath, something that was not quite a prayer, but was not quite anything else either. The French trumpets sounded. The French mounted division moved first. The marshals Clermont and Audrehem had argued in the war council the evening before about how to approach the English line. Audrehem wanted to charge directly, fast, hard, using speed to pass through the arrow kill zone before the archers could do decisive damage. Clermont thought the better approach was to move the mounted division around the flank of the English position, where the hedgerows ended, and strike from the side. The argument had not produced a clean resolution. What it produced was a compromise. The charge would go forward, but the division would be split, with Audrehem's men going at the lane directly, and Clermont's swinging to find the flank. Compromise in war council is often a way of producing 2 half measures where 1 full measure was required. The trumpets of the French mounted division sounded in the morning air, high and sharp, carrying the specific quality of medieval cavalry signals that meant, "Go now." And the destriers, the great war horses of the French nobility, bred over generations to carry 200 pounds of armored man at speed, surged forward from a walk into a trot, into a canter, into something approaching a gallop as the lane came into focus ahead of them. The first arrows reached them at 200 yards. At 200 yards, the war arrow does not penetrate plate armor reliably. At 200 yards, it penetrates horses with considerable reliability, because horses are larger than the gaps in their armor, and because a horse struck by a broadhead arrow at any angle goes through a physiological process that the rider cannot easily manage from the saddle. The destriers at the front of the French mounted division were struck by the first volley from both sides of the lane simultaneously, arrows coming from the left hedge and the right hedge at angles that crossed in the lane itself, creating an interlocking field of fire that no movement within the lane could escape entirely. Horses went down. Not all of them, not even most of them from the first volley, but the ones that went down at the front of the column, and the horses behind them had no room to stop and no room to swerve, and the lane was 15 feet wide, and the hedgerows were dense enough that swerving into them was merely a different kind of disaster. The second volley came before the first had finished its effect. The English archers on either side of the lane were shooting at the practiced rate of a trained man with a full quiver. Pull, aim, loose. Reach, pull, aim, loose. The motion so internalized after years of training that the individual arrows were not decisions, but reflexes. Each arrow took approximately 5 seconds from reach to release. 1,000 archers shooting in rotation produced something close to continuous fire, rather than volleys with gaps between them, and the French cavalry entering the lane experienced not a sequence of strikes, but something more like a sustained presence of lethal metal moving through the air at the altitude of a horse's chest. Marshal Audreham's division disintegrated. This is not an imprecise statement. The horses at the front went down, and the horses behind them could not stop, and the formation that had been a column became a pile, and the men in the pile, who were not immediately killed, were dismounted and pinned under their horses, or struggling to rise in armor that weighed 60 pounds on ground churned by several hundred horses' hooves. And the archers maintained their fire, because the men on the ground were also targets, and armor on the ground provided less protection than armor on horseback. But Marshal Clermont had found the flank. On the left of the English position, Clermont's horsemen had swung around the end of the hedgerow and were advancing on the English line at an angle that bypassed the lane, approaching the archers from the side rather than the front, reducing the time they were in the arrow kill zone, gaining the ground that would bring them to lance range before the archers could work their attrition fully. Jean Chandos saw Clermont coming. He pointed and said to the Black Prince what needed to be said in 2 words: the left. The Black Prince directed a contingent of his mounted reserve to the left, not the Captal de Buca's hidden force, which was held back, but a smaller cavalry unit that could respond to the flanking threat immediately. The English cavalry hit Clermont's advancing horsemen in a close engagement that quickly devolved into the specific chaos of cavalry against cavalry in confined ground, where numbers were less important than the quality of the individual fighters, and the quality of the individual fighters on both sides was very high. Clermont was hit by an arrow. He fell from his horse. The left flanking attempt died with its commander. Both marshals were now out of the battle. Audreham captured in the wreckage of the Lane, Clermont dead on the left flank. The mounted division was gone, destroyed or dispersed, and the first test of the English position had been passed, at a cost in arrows that Thomas of Shropshire and every other archer on that ridge was very carefully not calculating as they retrieved what shafts they could from the ground around them and from the bodies of horses. But the second French division was already moving. The boots of the Dauphin's division had watched the cavalry charge from their position behind it, and what they had watched was instructive in ways that cavalry commanders were still refusing to process, but that infantry commanders could not ignore. The Dauphin Charles was 17 years old, and his advisors were making the decisions. The decision they made was to advance on foot, as the French War Council had intended, with the cavalry charge serving as a preparation, weakening the English archers' arrow supply, drawing their fire, softening the line, rather than as the decisive strike itself. In theory, this was correct. The cavalry charge had drawn fire, had forced the archers to exhaust arrows, had broken the English formation's confidence by making it absorb the spectacle of several thousand armored men bearing down on it at speed. But in practice, the cavalry charge had not weakened the English archers in any meaningful way. The archers had shot approximately 2,000 arrows in the Lane engagement and the flanking repulse. 2,000 arrows from a force with supply wagons positioned behind the line was not a depletion event. The Dauphin's infantry was advancing toward English archers, who were tired but not exhausted, whose quivers were reduced but not empty, and who were fully capable of repeating the Lane performance at infantry speeds rather than cavalry speeds, which meant they had more time to aim and more time to recover between shots. The Dauphin's division came forward on foot in the late morning, and the ground between the two armies was already difficult. It was difficult because of what the cavalry charge had left on it. Dead horses and dismounted men and the equipment of a destroyed division lay across the approaches to the English line, and the French infantry advancing through this debris moved slowly, picking their way, the men at the front stepping around obstacles that the men behind them could not yet see, the formation losing the coherence that gave it its weight. The archers on both sides of the Lane began to shoot again, and the arrows fell into the French infantry at the same sustained rate they had maintained against the cavalry. But infantry advance at a walking pace through difficult ground, and the time the French were in the arrow kill zone was longer than any horse ever managed. Men began to fall. Not in the concentrated disaster of the Lane. The Dauphin's division was broader and more dispersed than the cavalry column, which distributed the casualties rather than concentrating them. But the casualties were real, and they were mounting. And the men advancing through them were stepping over or around their fallen companions while maintaining the discipline of forward movement, which requires a quality of determination that most military training can produce in short bursts, but that becomes harder to maintain the longer the burst is required. A man steps over a dead companion and keeps moving forward. Then he steps over another. Then he watches the man beside him take an arrow in the gap above his pauldron and go down. And he steps over that man too. Each step is a decision renewed, and the decisions get harder. But the Dauphin's men reached the English line. This was different from the cavalry charge. The French infantry that closed to sword range with the English men-at-arms in the center of the Black Prince's position were armored men fighting armored men in the grinding, close-quarters work of 14th century infantry combat. Visors down, shields raised, the short movements of men fighting in armor that weighs 60 pounds and makes every action consume twice the energy it would without the weight. The English line bent under the pressure. The archers on the flanks were still shooting, but their angles were now dangerous. Shots that could strike French soldiers might also strike English men-at-arms in the close engagement, and the archers were selecting their targets with the care that close-quarters support required. The Dauphin's division pushed the English center back. Not far, 40 yards, perhaps 50, the English line yielding to the weight of French infantry pressure while maintaining the formation that kept it from becoming a rout. But yielding. The Black Prince watched from behind the line and understood that his center was being spent, that the French infantry pressure was a different problem than the cavalry charge had been, and that the solution to it would need to come from somewhere other than the men at the point of contact. He needed the Dauphin's division to stop. By midday, the Dauphin's men had been in contact with the English line for the better part of an hour, and exhaustion was working on both sides. Armored infantry combat is among the most physically demanding activities that the human body can be asked to perform, and the men in the Dauphin's division who had marched 2 miles from their starting position and then fought for an hour in plate armor in September heat were approaching the limit of what their bodies could sustain. The heat inside a closed helm in September in central France accumulates faster than most men expect, and the water reserves that soldiers carry into battle are spent quickly in engagements of this duration. Thirst and heat and the weight of armor and the endless physical effort of staying upright while someone was trying to knock you down combined in each man into a particular kind of exhaustion that the will could hold off for a while, but not indefinitely. The Dauphin's division stopped. It did not rout, but it stopped. It held its ground, and then, as the pressure from both sides eased, it began the specific backward movement of a force that has done its work and is withdrawing rather than retreating. The difference being, in military terms, whether the withdrawal is controlled or not. The Dauphin's division withdrew in reasonable order, the young prince at its center toward the French rear. The English center straightened, but the 3rd French division, the Duke of Orléans' men, was behind the Dauphin, and from the English position on the ridge, the men who had just pushed back the Dauphin's assault could see the 3rd division forming up to advance. The Duke Who Ran. What happened to the Duke of Orléans' division is the most debated moment in the Battle of Poitiers. It is not debated because the sources are silent on it. It is debated because the sources are clear, and what they clearly record reflects poorly on one of the great lords of France, and the historiographical tradition that followed had reasons to find alternative interpretations. Froissart records it plainly. When the Duke of Orléans saw the Dauphin's division withdrawing, and understood, or believed he understood, that the Dauphin's men were routing, he made a decision. He turned his division around and left the field. This was not a tactical withdrawal. There is no evidence that the Duke of Orléans had received an order to withdraw, or that his division had been engaged and found the situation untenable, or that any military logic supported the movement he initiated. What the sources record is that a division of French men-at-arms, the third of 4 divisions in the French battle plan, turned away from the English position and moved south, passing the advance of King John's 4th Division in the process, and did not return. The effect on the French army was catastrophic. King John's division, advancing north toward the English position, encountered the Duke of Orléans' division moving south past them. And what the men in John's division saw, men who had not yet fought, who were fresh, who were the most powerful force France had assembled that day, was the 3rd French division retreating. They did not know it was the 3rd division retreating from nothing. They knew it looked like retreat, and retreat in the middle of a battle is a message that spreads faster than any officer can counter it. Some men in John's division stopped advancing. Some began to turn. The formation that had been the most ordered and powerful unit on the French side of the field developed, in the space of a few minutes, the specific structural instability of a large formation whose constituent units have stopped agreeing with each other about what direction to move. On the ridge above, the Black Prince saw the Orléans division moving. He saw what it meant before he fully understood what had caused it. Jean Chandos rode to him. The moment was perfectly clear in Chandos's assessment. The French had left a gap between their retired divisions and the advancing 4th Division. King John's men were advancing, but their flanks were exposed, and their formation was disrupted by the Orléans withdrawal. The English center had just repulsed the Dauphin's assault, and had a few minutes of relative recovery. The Captal de Buc's hidden force on the right flank was still intact and fresh, and positioned exactly where it would need to be if the Black Prince wanted to execute a counterattack now. Chandos said, "Advance." The Black Prince said, "Sound the advance." The Black Prince charges. The English army came off the ridge. This is the moment that makes Poitiers something more than a successful defensive action, and converts it into one of the decisive tactical events of the century. An army that has been defending all morning, that is hungry and tired and outnumbered, that has spent the morning shooting arrows at advancing French formations and holding a bending line, goes forward, not in retreat, not in desperate sally. In a deliberate, coordinated counterattack against the largest and most powerful French division on the field. The Black Prince led from the front, mounted, his armor identifiable by the Prince of Wales feathers on his shield, advancing at the head of his men-at-arms toward King John's advancing division, at the precise moment when that division was most vulnerable. Committed to an advance it had not fully organized, its flanks uncovered by the disappearance of the Orléans division, its formations unsteady from the confusion of watching friendly troops move the wrong direction. The archers came with them. The English archers who came off the ridge were not archers in the static sense of the morning's fighting. They were moving, shooting on the advance, picking targets in the gaps of the French formation. The men on the flanks of John's division who were exposed by the absence of the Orléans covering force. The horses of the French cavalry attached to the 4th Division who were targetable at these ranges. The crossbowmen in the French rear who might provide covering fire against the English advance if given time to operate. But there was no time to operate. The English were moving too fast. The pace of the advance had been calibrated to the one narrow window that Chandos had identified. Before the French commanders could reorganize the disrupted 4th Division, before the Orléans men could return, if they decided to return, before the Captal's surprise was lost to the French scouts, who would eventually see around the hedgerow. The English advance was a race against French recovery, and the English were determined to win that race before it could be run. They did not give them time. The Captal de Buc's cavalry swept around the right flank of King John's division at precisely the moment the English center made contact from the front. The Captal's men came around a hedgerow and into the rear of the French division with a speed that the French had no time to address. The rear ranks turning to face a cavalry threat they had not expected from a direction they had not covered. The front ranks engaged with the English men-at-arms coming from the ridge. The middle ranks caught between both threats, with no direction to move that wasn't occupied by either friend or enemy. King John's division did not shatter the way the mounted division had in the lane. It was made of better material, led by a king who was genuinely fighting rather than commanding from the rear, formed of veterans who had been through engagements before, and who knew the difference between a desperate situation and a terminal one. But desperate it was, and the English counterattack had achieved the condition that the Captal de Buc's positioning had been designed to achieve. A French division simultaneously engaged from front, rear, and flank, with no coherent formation remaining to address all three pressures simultaneously. An army is an organization, and when the organization loses its shape, what remains is a collection of individuals. Individuals can fight, but they cannot fight an army. The fighting in John's division was the hardest fighting of the day. This was not the impersonal destruction of the chariot lane, where arrows dropped men before they could see who was killing them. This was close work, face to face, the grinding intimacy of armored men in close combat, trying to find the gaps in each other's armor with sword points and axe blades. The French knights in John's division fought with the particular determination of men who had no choice about it. Surrounded, their division dissolving around them, their king visible in the center of the press, his standard still raised, the axe in his hand still moving. But the English pressure was relentless, and the French formation was gone, replaced by a crowd of individual combats that had lost the organizational coherence that made a military division more than the sum of its parts. Men began to break for the rear in ones and twos, then in larger groups, then in the specific cascade that turns a fighting force into a rout. The King in the Field. King John II of France did not run. He was surrounded. His division was gone around him, broken and fleeing in the cascade that the Captal's flank attack and the English front attack had between them produced. The field was full of the sounds of a rout, men shouting in French as they ran, English and Gascon voices calling for surrender, the specific clatter of armor abandoned by men who decided that 60 pounds of steel was too high a price for another 50 yards of speed. But John was still fighting. Around him, perhaps 100 men remained, the knights of his closest household, men whose obligation of personal loyalty to the king made retreat unthinkable, regardless of what the rest of the army was doing. They closed ranks around him, and they fought with the specific quality of men who have accepted that the fight will end when they stop being able to fight, rather than when the outcome becomes clear. The English and Gascon soldiers, converging on the knot of resistance around the French standard, understood what they were looking at. Every soldier on that field understood that the man fighting at the center of the remaining French resistance was the King of France, and that the King of France, in English hands, was worth more than any other outcome of any battle in living memory. The question was not whether John would be captured. The question was which Englishman or Gascon would lay hands on him first. This produced a situation that the chroniclers record with a mixture of dark comedy and genuine admiration. Multiple soldiers simultaneously attempted to accept John's surrender. John could not surrender to all of them. He would not surrender to any of them, until he found a man of sufficient rank that the transaction was appropriate by the standards of the chivalric code that governed such matters. A code which, even here, even surrounded, even in the middle of a collapsed army on a losing field, he was not willing to abandon. To surrender to a common soldier was an insult to his dignity that the code would not allow. Denis de Morbecque, a French knight who had been exiled from France for political reasons and was serving in English service, pushed through the crowd and identified himself to John in French. He was a knight. He was of sufficient rank. He said, "Sire, surrender yourself." John surrendered. He gave his right gauntlet, the medieval symbol of capitulation, to de Morbecque, and the King of France was a prisoner of the English for the first time since the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, and the plain south of Poitiers was, in the middle of a September afternoon, the most significant piece of ground in Europe. A King at Dinner. The field that evening was quiet, in the way that fields after battles are quiet, with the specific heaviness of events that have been too large for the space they occurred in, that have left residue in the air and on the ground, that the simple return of ambient sound cannot displace. The English had won. The word does not contain the scale of what had happened. The French casualties were staggering. Approximately 2,500 men of the French army were dead on the field. Knights and men-at-arms and infantry and crossbowmen, the great lords of France among them, the Count of Tancarville, the Bishop of Châlons, the Count of Damartin, men whose names occupied significant pages in the French peerage, lying in the dirt between the hedgerows, with their armor stripped by English soldiers who understood that armor was worth money, and the dead did not require it. The number of captured men was at least as large, perhaps 2,000 men taken prisoner, including the Constable of France, several marshals, the Seneschal of Poitou, and a long list of barons and knights whose ransoms would take years to negotiate and pay. And the king. The king was worth more than all of them combined. The Black Prince received King John in his tent with a ceremony that Froissart records in detail, because it was the kind of scene that Froissart's chivalric sensibility was built to appreciate. The prince served John at table. He did not sit in John's presence. He stood, holding the cup, offering the courses. And he said, according to Froissart, who may or may not have been reporting exact words, that John should not be discouraged by what had happened, because fortune was capricious, and that a greater honor lay in being captured than in defeating lesser men. This was, under the circumstances, an extraordinary thing to say to a man whose army had just been destroyed and whose kingdom had just become ungovernable. But it was also a performance of chivalric values that both men understood, in which the victor demonstrated the magnanimity that the code required, and the defeated king received the dignity that his rank entitled him to. The performance mattered, not because it changed anything about the military reality of what had just happened, but because the system within which both men operated required that certain forms be maintained, even when the content beneath the forms had become irrelevant. John ate. He accepted the courtesy. He was a prisoner. The Black Prince's losses were real, but proportionally small in a way that reflects the advantage of the defensive position his archers had provided. The English casualty figures are uncertain. The sources give numbers that range from negligible to several hundred dead. But the consensus of historical analysis suggests something in the range of 200 to 300 English and Gascon dead, against 2,500 French killed and 2,000 captured. In the arithmetic of medieval battle, this was not merely a victory. It was a massacre. The word in the title is not metaphor. The soldiers who had not been killed spent the evening of September 19th doing the work that follows battle. The wounded were tended, English and Gascon wounded first, the practice of the period. then the French prisoners who could afford the medical attention their ransoms would eventually pay for. The dead were identified by their companions, where possible, and by their armor, where companions were absent. The valuable equipment was sorted, assessed, divided among the soldiers who had captured it, according to the customs of the period. Every man's right to the plunder of his personal conquests. The more senior commander's right to a share of the more significant captures. The prisoner processing was a significant operation in itself. 2,000 captive knights and men-at-arms required supervision, required the formal pledges of parole that the chivalric code demanded before they could be released on their own recognizance pending ransom, required the establishment of which prisoner belonged to which captor, in a way that would survive the legal challenges that would inevitably arise when ransom negotiations became serious in the months to come. Denis de Maubec, who had accepted the king's surrender, was already in a dispute with another Gascon soldier who claimed to have been there first. The sun went down over the plain of Maupertuis. The hedgerows was still there. The lane was still there. The bodies of the horses that had died in the lane were still there, and would be for some time. The equipment was being stripped by torchlight, and the night air smelled of the battlefield in September. And in the English camp, the King of France ate dinner served to him by the man who had destroyed his army. And in what remained of the French camp, the survivors were trying to understand what had happened, and whether anything could be done about it. Nothing could be done about it immediately, but France would not be ungoverned for long. What Poitiers broke. The political consequences of the capture of King John II began the moment de Maubec received his gauntlet, and accelerated through the months that followed, with the specific chaos of a medieval kingdom whose organizing principle, the king, had been removed. France in the winter of 1356 to 1357 was a country trying to function without the man who made it function. The Dauphin Charles, 17 years old and untested, attempted to govern in his father's absence, while the Estates General, the representative body of French clergy, nobility, and commons, demanded political reforms as the price of the money required to pay John's ransom. The reform demands were extensive. The Dauphin refused most of them. The Estates General went home frustrated and resentful, and what followed in the summer of 1358 was the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising in northern France of extraordinary violence, in which the peasantry of several regions rose against the nobility that had failed to protect them at Crécy and Poitiers, and demanded, with axes and fire, the accounting that the political system had not provided. The Jacquerie was suppressed. The reforms were eventually abandoned. France stabilized under the Dauphin's increasingly capable management. But the social violence of 1358 was a direct consequence of Poitiers, of the exposure of the chivalric order's failure. of the demonstration that the knights whose social function was to protect France could be destroyed by English commoners with bows, while the peasants who paid for those knights' armor and horses watched their villages burn. The ransom of John II was set at 3 million gold écus, the largest ransom in medieval history. To put it in some kind of proportion, it represented approximately twice the annual revenue of the English crown. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 formalized the terms. John would be released on payment of a first installment of 600,000 écus, with the remainder to follow, and France would cede Aquitaine, Poitou, Calais, and a large portion of the southwest to English sovereignty in perpetuity, as the price of the peace that both sides needed. John went home in 1360 on parole. He returned to London in 1364, when his son, who had been left as a hostage for the ransom, escaped from English custody. John said that faith and honor required him to return. He died in London that year, a prisoner to the last. The long-term impact of Poitiers on the conduct of medieval warfare was profound and permanent. The lesson that Crécy had taught, that mounted knights charging longbowmen were not cavalry using their greatest advantage, but targets being deployed at optimal range, was confirmed so completely at Poitiers that French military doctrine never recovered its pre-Crécy confidence. The infantry reforms that the French army adopted in the generation after Poitiers, the increasing use of dismounted men-at-arms in the Swiss and later French tactical tradition, the declining centrality of the armored charge as the decisive moment of medieval battle. All of this runs forward from Poitiers. The English longbow itself was at its zenith in 1356. It would remain the dominant factor in English military capability for another 60 years, until the adoption of gunpowder artillery in the 15th century began to change the dynamics of siege warfare, and eventually of field battles as well. But Poitiers is the moment when the longbow's reputation was fully established. Not as a weapon useful in specific circumstances, but as the decisive instrument of English military power, capable of destroying any cavalry formation that approached within its effective range, regardless of the prestige or the numbers of the cavalry. The chivalric ideal, the shared system of honor and conduct that governed how medieval noblemen fought and treated their prisoners, and understood the purpose of war, survived Poitiers as a social concept, but not as a military one. John II, serving his own prisoner at dinner, was a last flower of that ideal, beautiful and perfectly genuine, and entirely disconnected from the military reality of what had produced the situation it was performed in. Within a century, the codes that governed the taking and treatment of prisoners would be replaced by the rather less elegant economics of ransom calculation, and the idea that a king should return to captivity because honor required it would seem less a virtue than an incomprehensible eccentricity. Centuries later, the ridge at Maupertuis is agricultural land in the Vienne department of France, south of the city of Poitiers. Vineyards and fields cover the ground where Thomas of Shropshire stood with his bow in the September fog and waited for the cavalry to enter the lane. The hedgerows that channeled the French charge are long gone, replaced by the boundaries of modern fields. A monument stands near the village of Maupertuis, marking the approximate location of the English position. The lane is a farm track. Centuries of seasons have turned the ground that held 8,000 dead and captured Frenchmen back into the same working land it was before 6,000 hungry Englishmen arrived and held a ridge. But somewhere in the accumulated decisions of every European army that came after 1356, the calculation that Poitiers enforced is still working. Numbers are not enough. The ground must be chosen. The weapon must be placed where the enemy must come to it. And when the moment comes, when the 3rd Division turns the wrong direction, and the 4th Division's flank is uncovered, and the archers have arrows still in their quivers, you do not defend. You go forward. The Black Prince knew this. His archers had already proven it, standing in the hedge shadows with their bows bent and their eyes on the lane. 2 kingdoms clashed above a French valley. Only one of them understood the ground.